Vincent Keymer is currently the fourth best chess player in the world, and in this video I want to go over 3 games that he played in recent title Tuesdays where he played the Caro Kann. The way that Keymer plays the Caro Kann, you will know if you watched the previous video just how crazy it is, and I have some more here for you today. The first one we won't spend too long on, but it is a very interesting game against Hikaru Nakamura, who is just ahead of him in the overall rankings. So in this game, we have an interesting system from Hikaru, who plays the 2 knights attack, which can lead to some very dangerous lines for the uninitiated. For example, after takes and something like knight f6, you get some interesting lines after queen to e2, and black can get into a bit of trouble if he's not careful after something like takes, let's say knight to d7, bishop c4, knight f6 attacking the queen, knight e5 threatening checkmate. So if this is taken, black just loses. And after e6, which is the only move here, I hate this position for the black pieces personally, which is why I don't play this line with black, because the light squared bishop absolutely sucks. But Hikaru plays knight g3 in this position, which objectively isn't an amazing move, and Keymer immediately exposes the reason why, which is the same line that I play, which is h5. And the problem for Hikaru is that h4 will kick this knight away, and the knight doesn't have all that many squares to go to. If Hikaru plays pawn to h4, which is the most common move in this position from the white side, actually, then the g4 square is extremely vulnerable. So after something like bishop to g4, this knight is pinned to the white queen, and the bishop can never be removed because the pawn obviously can't go to h3, which is why Hikaru plays this interesting move bishop to c4. So Keymer, of course, plays h4, kicks the knight away, the knight goes back to f1, and goes knight b to d7. The engine isn't thrilled with this move. It prefers pawn h3, which I really like in this position. I've had a lot of success with this type of thing, but he does go for it later. So we have knight b d7. Here, Hikaru should play pawn to h3, but he doesn't. He plays pawn to a4, which is an interesting move. To be fair, sometimes this bishop can get into a little bit of trouble with queenside expansion from black. So perhaps it was played to... Perhaps a4 was played to stop any b5 ideas, or like b5, c5, bishop c7, a6 sort of setup maybe. But we have knight b6 attacking the bishop, and after the bishop retreats, the knight comes to d5. This is an incredibly common maneuver in lots of different versions of the Caro Kann. And the reason why black, I would say, has an easier position here, one, the white knight is misplaced, although it can come to e3 relatively easily. But more importantly, this h-pawn, if it reaches the h3 square, I mean, white is just going to be in trouble. So we have d4, bishop to f5, pawn to c3, which the engine really doesn't like. It really wants pawn h3. It's been screaming that for many, many moves now. And eventually Keymer plays it with pawn to h3. Now, why would taking be so bad for white? Well, to be fair, you don't even have to take back, but it's perfectly reasonable to take back. And the problem now is that white is punished for playing the move a4, because now white can't really castle kingside because of this bishop in the open h-file, and castling queenside would be very risky with the a-pawn committed to a4. So instead we have g3. White is going to have to castle kingside because his queenside is so far advanced, but this h-pawn is going to cause problems in the future potentially. So we have pawn e6. Keymer is ready to develop the dark squared bishop. Knight 1 to d2, bringing the knight back into the game. The knight could look at the c4 square and into e5 in the future, potentially. We have bishop to d6, which is just a very good square for the bishop. Engine also likes bishop to e7, but the bishop is fine here. We have castles kingside, pawn to a5 from Keymer, stopping any pawn to b4 ideas in the future. Knight c4, hitting the bishop and the pawn on a5, and bishop back to c7. This, if you have not seen before, is a very common positional sort of dynamic between a knight and a bishop, where the bishop controls all of the forward movement of the knight, when there are these two squares between them, either vertically or horizontally. Works either way. So we have knight g5, which is a strange move, I have to say. The engine here prefers bishop g5 or rook e1. Even something like bishop to d3 or knight to e5 looks natural to me. But we have knight g5. Okay, putting pressure on the pawn. Maybe Hikaru wants to play pawn f4. We have knight to e4 from Keymer, offering a trade of knights, which Hikaru obliges to, so takes and takes. We have bishop to f3, offering a bishop trade. Now, here the engine wants rook e1, and after something like queen to f6, bishop back to f1, and the engine wants to defend the g2 and h3 squares using a bishop on f1, but Hikaru offers a trade of bishops, which feels like a more natural solution to the problem. So we have bishop f3, queen f3, and queen to f6, offering a queen trade. Now, why would Keymer go for an endgame here? Because we have these doubled f-pawns. I mean, it might look very natural to take back with the knight, and taking back with the knight is fine. It's not wrong. But I really like in the Caro when you have these doubled f-pawns in lots of positions, because it controls the e5 and g5 squares, which obviously e5 this knight would love to come to, and now the knight can't go to e5 anymore, and this bishop can never use the g5 square. So I'm a massive fan of this position for Keymer. This knight on d5 is also incredibly strong, because if c4 is ever played to try and kick the knight away, the knight can always go to b4. And because, again, this pawn was pushed to a4 earlier on, the b4 square will be a great outpost for the knight. And not to mention this h3 pawn suffocating the white king. Now, the real question is going to be whether this h3 pawn becomes a weakness or not. Because if it remains a strength, Keymer should be better in this endgame. It's also very important to note that Hikaru doesn't have a light squared bishop. A light squared bishop would be very annoying for black to deal with, because it would target the pawn very easily, whereas, of course, the dark squared bishop can't see the h3 square. So we have rook e1, pawn f5, just advancing the pawn up the board. Here, knight to e5 looks very natural to me, but the engine wants to snap the knight off immediately and play for either b5 or bringing the king up and b5 in the future. Again, something like c4, knight b4, maybe bishop to d2 looks interesting. But even if this trade happens, I mean, knight d3 is the best move here. If this trade were to occur after something like takes and takes, the a pawn is a bit of a problem. And after something like b3 defending everything, the d pawn could be an issue for white. But again, you know, h3 needs to be looked after. So we have pawn f3 from Hikaru, likely preparing to bring the king to the f2 square. King e7 from Keymer, king f2, pawn f6. So by advancing f5, Keymer gave up his control of the e5 square, but then brings the other pawn to f6 to resume that control, which I'm a massive fan of. So bishop d2, king to f7, getting off of the e-file makes a lot of sense. Also, be aware this is a titled Tuesday game, so this is a blitz game. So, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but that's not the point of this video. Here we have knight e3, rook a to g8. Not the best move. Engine wants the immediate pawn f4. And if knight takes d5, we have fg3 with check, fg3, and ed5. And this passed h-pawn could be a problem, although rook h1 looks like it solves everything. So rook a g8, pawn to f4, knight back to b6, maybe applying a bit of pressure to the a4 pawn. Pawn b3 keeping the knight out. Just like I said before with the knight and bishop relationship, the pawn and knight relationship is very similar, where this pawn stops the knight from advancing far up the board, but obviously it can't cover a square like d5 like a bishop could. Similar concept though. So we have rook d8. This d-pawn could be a problem if either e5 or c5 can be played, because this bishop is undefended. We have rook e2 defending the bishop, knight back to c8, preparing to reroute the knight somewhere, most likely into the e4 square, I would guess. We have knight c4, stopping knight to d6, because then a trade will occur. So we have rook h2, e8. The h-pawn is pretty well protected, and it's very hard for white to attack it, because he can't use the third rank without sacrificing a pawn on g4. And if that happens, then h3 will of course be defended. So we have king f3, maybe preparing g4. pawn b6, keeping an eye on the a5 pawn, maybe preparing c5. Rook a2, e1, pawn b5. Now, you may be asking, Alex, why did Keymer go b6 and then b5 on the very next move? Well, if b5 is played immediately, then after takes and takes, you'll notice the a pawn is hanging. So Keymer waits for Hikaru to move his rook off of the a file and then offers Hikaru the opportunity to open the a file. So Hikaru brings the knight back. We have knight into d6. So by playing b5, Keymer forces the knight away and wins control of d6, therefore winning control of e4. So we have knight d3, knight e4, knight back to f2, trying to offer a trade, which Keymer has to accept. But after takes and bishop to b6, it's looking like e5 or c5 is going to happen at some point. And remember, the more pieces that come off the board, this h-pawn could become stronger and stronger because it's so difficult for white to attack it because g4 can't be played because of takes. So bishop to e3, rook d7, preparing to double up, king f3, and rook to d6. Be aware, they're very low on time. Rook c1, rook c8, rook c to c2. I would assume, are really, really low on time here, but we have takes, and c5. Looking for the breakthrough. Rook e to d2. And here Keymer's winning after takes and takes, and rook d2. If Hikaru takes on d4 after rook d4, a4 is incredibly weak. And so if you play rook to a2 trying to defend, there is simply e5, and the e-pawn is going to be a passer. And the combination of the weak a-pawn, the strong e-pawn, and the strong h-pawn should be enough to win. Keymer is also up a pawn. So we have rook to d2 pinning, pawn to e5 only move defending the bishop. If this bishop is taken, then we will have rook d4. If this trade occurs after takes and takes, the important part is that the king cannot go to e4. The king would have to try and come the long way round, which just gives the black king enough time to defend the pawn. And the king can basically, after something like this, can leave the pawn over here to go and take on a4. And after something like takes, king over here, king up, the a-pawn will just promote. So we have pawn g4. Hikaru tries to fight back. King to e6. If this capture happens, and after king g4, the h3 pawn will be very weak. So Keymer instead defends the f-pawn. So if takes and takes, the king stops this king coming into g4. If king to g3 is played, then there's problems with here, and bishop to e5, actually. Because if rook takes rook, there's bishop f4 with check first, and after takes, Keymer is just up a bishop. So very nice tactics. We have fe5, bishop h6, pawn e4 check, king g3. The king is going to win the h-pawn most likely, but at what cost? f4, disconnecting the bishop from the rook. We have rook takes, king takes, and these connected passers on the 4th rank already are far, far stronger than these connected passers because these are further up the board. Hikaru will try bishop g5, pawn f3, bishop d2, king marches up the board. This bishop always covers g7, so Keymer doesn't really have to worry about the g-pawn all that much. He sacrifices the a-pawn because his pawns are simply too fast. After king f1, bishop d4, Hikaru resigns the game because e2 and e1, or e2 and more likely pawn to f1 will happen. And if g7 is played, you could take, but you could also just ignore it. e2 check, bishop defends the f2 pawn, king moves, and promotion with check will end the game. So that was the two knights attack. Let's jump into the second game against Pranav. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but in this one we have an exchange variation. So we have bishop d3. Here, Keymer plays an interesting line with knight to f6. I always thought that knight c6, pawn c3 was the main line. And here, either knight to f6 or queen c7. I prefer queen c7, trying to play against bishop to f4. But something like knight f6 here looks very natural to me. Instead, we have c3 and the immediate bishop g4, which I know is a line, but it is very risky because of this move queen to b3, which his opponent plays. And after queen c7, there are some potentially dangerous lines after bishop f4 in certain variations. In this variation, it doesn't work, because if queen takes, basically the point is to deflect the black queen away from the defense of b7. there is queen c1 checkmate, right? Now, that's why this doesn't work in this particular line. And I think that's why Keymer didn't play knight to c6, right? Because if we have the same thing, except with knight c6 on the board, so let's say knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, queen b3, queen c7, bishop f4. Does it still work in this line? I don't think so. If check here... Yeah, oh no, it actually does work in this one, because if queen takes, then there's queen c6, and then the queen takes the rook, although there's some complications as to why black is actually okay. My point is, it's a very dangerous line, but Keymer clearly knows the theory better than I want to memorize. So queen b3, queen c7, knight to e2, preparing bishop to f4, which is why he takes on e2. If knight c6 is played, bishop f4 could be a problem. He'll be forced to play a move like e5, and this could be slightly scary after knight to h5. I'm personally not a fan of this position. So we have bishop e2, stopping bishop f4, bishop e2, and pawn to e6, preparing to develop the bishop to d3 and get this very nice battery on this diagonal. So we have knight d2, knight c6, knight f3, and bishop to d6. h3, preparing to castle, although h2 is already defended by the knight, so you could argue it's not necessary. Again, remember, this is a titled Tuesday game, so it's not going to be perfect. We have castles from Keymer, castles from Pranav, and knight to e4. This is effectively one of the ideas of trading off black's light-squared bishop for one of the white knights, because normally the white knights are on d2 and f3 in these types of variations in the exchange, whereas by trading off his bishop for the knight on e2 earlier on, Keymer effectively forces white to choose between having a knight defending e4 or attacking e5, which are the main squares in this structure, known as the Carlsbad structure. The main idea is for white to put a knight on e5, and normally black looks to launch the queenside pawns forward in a minority attack, but because e4 is available, Keymer can use it. So we have bishop d3 and pawn to f5, locking the knight in place. And the reason that the position is better here for black is because the knight can't be taken. After f takes e4, this knight will have to move, and the e-pawn is incredibly strong. This pawn chain is really hard to break, because how are you going to target e6? The open f-file, the open diagonal, the fact that rook can lift up to f6, double up, swing over, is going to be pretty devastating for white. So you can't take the knights. We have queen back to d1, rook a2, c8, a very normal developing move. The computer prefers queen to e7. I can't really understand that, because it feels like it's inviting this bishop to come into g5 at some point, although I suppose the problem is that, of course, the knight covers that square, and if this is taken, then again, we have this really strong pawn structure for black that white simply can't play against. But rook a to c8, rook to e1, rook to f6, preparing to swing over. We have pawn to c4, which is a common way for white to try and break up this, I don't even know what you would call it, like a pawn V, I guess. So, of course, if this capture happens, then the knight is going to be destabilized after takes and takes. Black can claim that the c-pawn is strong, but the e-pawn is very weak. So, in this position, after pawn to c4, Keymer plays knight takes f2. Knight takes f2. What a move. This is why Keymer is a maniac, by the way. The first game was a bit more tame, but these two that I'm going to show you are not tame. So knight f2. Okay, what's the point? King f2. The engine doesn't agree with it, clearly, but why? We have dc4. And you now see the point of bringing the rook to c8, because now this bishop could be a problem if it comes to c4. The engine wants white to retreat the bishop and allow bishop g3 check, and after king g1, bishop e1, and queen e1, the engine thinks that this is okay for white. He has two bishops for a rook and two pawns. Theoretically, Keymer has more material, but white has the bishop pair. However, Pranav plays the very natural bishop takes c4. Of course, e6 is weak. What is Keymer going to do? Well, okay, bishop to g3 check, skewering the king and the rook, and potentially opening up threats against the bishop if the knight can move. We have king g1, bishop takes e1, queen takes e1, which is actually inaccurate. The engine wants knight takes e1, which looks a little bit ridiculous. But the point is that if knight e1, then after knight d4, the queen can take on d4, and after queen c4, there is queen c4 and rook c4, and this endgame is potentially holdable with the 2 rooks and 2 pawns versus the knight and bishop for white. The problem with queen e1 is that after knight d4, there's knight d4, not queen d4, and after queen takes c4, there's no queen trade, and the white king could be in some trouble with the queen still on the board. Now, that's obviously a very difficult evaluation to make during the game anyway, especially in a blitz game. So we have knight back to f3, queen b5, which is a mistake, apparently, according to the computer. I mean, it looks very natural, applying pressure to the b2 pawn. The engine wants queen e4, offering a queen trade, because if takes, and the knight moves to, let's say, d4, then e5, let's say knight back to e2, rook c2, the rooks will get on to the second rank very easily, is the idea. But we have queen b5 trying to stop the bishop from developing, which looks very natural. We have bishop to e3 anyway. If the queen takes, then there is bishop to d4, forking the queen and the rook. So we, instead of rook to g6, the engine here is screaming for e5, advancing the pawn up the board to make use of the extra couple of pawns. But we have rook g6 instead. We have rook c1, which the engine isn't a fan of. It wants knight h4, attacking the rook, and the rook has to go back to f6, and then after bishop to d4, the rook will have to move, and I assume queen e6 is the problem. But his opponent misses that. He goes rook c1, and Keymer obliges to the rook trade and plays h6, giving his king a way out. Now, if this pawn can make it to e4, black might be better. But until then, the 2 minor pieces should be very nice for white. So we have king f2, trying to keep an eye on the minor pieces and stop any queen e2 ideas. The engine hates that because of the move e5, which Keymer plays. Pawn a4, attacking the black queen, and here queen to e8 is played. The engine here wants queen c6, which looks a bit insane. Now, the knight can't take on e5, because then g2 is going to be a problem after queen takes g2. And if queen takes queen, rook takes, again you're thinking, well, what about knight e5? The engine thinks that after rook c2, king f3, and rook b2, that black is winning in this position, I assume because a4 is very hard to defend. I mean, bishop a7, rook a2, bishop f2, rook a4, the passed b pawn is very nice. But it makes sense for Keymer to keep queens on the board with this vulnerable king. And I mean, black is still better anyway. So here we have bishop takes a7, queen takes a4, bishop back to e3, which is completely losing. Apparently knight e5 has to be played, counter-attacking this rook, even though queen a7 comes with check. There's king f3, and then the rook goes to f6, the queen comes to c8, and after the king marches up the board, knight d7 attacking the rook, and after rook to f7, there's some kind of repetition because the rook needs to defend the pawn on f5 to prevent a perpetual or checkmate. It's an insane line. White plays the very natural bishop e3. We have pawn f4, kicking the bishop to c5. Queen e4. Here, pawn e4 is the better move, kicking the knight away. And then after something like e3, king back to g1, and rook c6, the white position is in a lot of trouble. And like I said earlier, once these pawns make it up the board, they will start to count. Instead, we have queen e4, preventing the knight from moving because of the g2 square. We have queen c3, attacking the e5 pawn, best move from Pranav. And we have pawn b6, hitting the bishop. Engine doesn't like it, but only if white plays bishop to b4, which doesn't look like a good move because it looks like the bishop is now a target. Why is the bishop good on b4? Well, the engine thinks after rook c6, queen b3, king h7, that the bishop should reroute itself to c3 to apply pressure to e5. But Pranav plays the very natural bishop to a3. I mean, the bishop is on an okay diagonal, defends the b pawn defends the bishop. And unlike the bishop on b4, the queen is not tasked with defending the bishop. Again, remember that both of the players are going to be low on time at this point. So we have king to h7, best move from Keymer, getting the king out of any danger. pawn to h4, advancing down the board. Maybe some knight g5 ideas in the future. Maybe pawn h5, trying to open up this diagonal for the white queen. Rook e6. Keymer has to be very careful because white has 2 minor pieces for the rook. But, again, Keymer has the extra pawns. Can he hold on to them? We have pawn h5. Queen to f5, applying pressure to the h-pawn. Queen c4, applying pressure to the rook. Of course, if takes, then takes. So we have rook to f6, a very natural looking move. Engine hates it. Engine wants pawn to e4, allowing knight d4 with the fork, because after pawn to e3, king to g1, there is queen b1, and after king to h2, for example, there's rook e5. These are all only moves, though. So we have rook f6, very natural. Knight h4 attacking the queen. We have queen takes h5. And here, white has a draw. After queen e4, king h8, queen a8, king h7, queen e4, king h8, queen a8, king h7. White doesn't go for the repetition. White had a draw, but he doesn't go for it. He plays knight to f3. And this allows queen f5. Now, this diagonal is shut. And after knight back to h4, black doesn't have to put the queen back on h5. He goes queen c2. And the white king is getting hunted down. But Keymer actually just offers a queen trade. Because if it's accepted, after queen c6, rook c6, then these pawns are incredibly powerful. We have a 4 versus 1. That's going to be an issue, especially with these pawns already so far up the board. And the bishop is kind of out of the game. You can see why the bishop would have been amazing on c3. But we have queen c1. Sorry, queen to d8. I don't know where I got c1 from. Pawn e4, bishop to e7, attacking the rook. Rook to f7, trying to keep everything under control. Bishop back to a3, queen to e6, preparing to push the pawns down the board. Pawn g5, and the knight is trapped. Pawn b3, Keymer wins the knight. And yes, Pranav sets up this battery, but after king g6, marching the king up the board, march the pawn up the board, Pranav can give a check, but that's about it. And after e2, bishop e1, queen f5, king h2, pawn f3. I mean, Keymer is just crashing through the position. If this rook gets to g6, for example, the game is over. I mean, there's very little that white can do. After queen f4 check, king h1, queen f3, king h2, queen f4, king h1, queen e4, king h2. Gives a bunch of checks, I assume, to gain time on the clock, and eventually play queen g5 check, forcing a trade. Although there is mate in 8, it doesn't really matter, because this forces the queens off the board, and Pranav resigns after queen to g5 check. So, a very interesting idea in the exchange variation, trading off the light squared bishop so early, getting this kind of Pillsbury knight on the e4 square, and then just going for a mad exchange, well, not an exchange sacrifice, but sacrificing 2 pieces for a rook and 2 pawns. Having a perpetual check, but his opponent doesn't go for it, and then Keymer makes him pay later in the game. Let's go on to the third game between, again, entitled Tuesday, Manvel and Keymer. In this one, we have a Tartakower, which is one of my favorites. I haven't actually reviewed this game all the way through yet, but you'll see why I chose it. So we have pawn c3, and this is saving the best till last, by the way. After castles, queen c2, eyeing up the h7 pawn. Keymer plays a move that 99% of you have probably won't even consider in this position. Not pawn g6, blocking the diagonal. Not pawn h6, getting rid of the h7 pawn from being a target, but pawn h5. Well, after rook e8 check, knight e2, then pawn h5. This is a very modern line in the Tartakower. The point is to try and stop g4 in conjunction with this bishop. I personally hate this line for black, but I am not as good a player as Keymer, of course. So we have bishop to e3, knight to d7, and castles queenside. This is one of the most aggressive ways that white can play against the Tartakower. We have pawn b5. Engine hates it because of pawn d5 from white, which his opponent finds. We have pawn c5, offering up the b5 pawn, which his opponent doesn't take. It's the best move, but his opponent doesn't take it, because why would you open up the b file against your own king? It looks a bit strange. Instead, we have knight g3, and black is better if he goes rook to b8, sacrificing the pawn on h5, and going knight to e5, going after the bishop. Keymer doesn't play that. He plays c4. hitting the bishop. And after bishop h7, king h8, knight h5, white is up a pawn. But knight h5 is a mistake. Keymer sacrifices a pawn in front of his own king to play knight e5. Now, why is knight e5 so good? Well, firstly, you have to be very careful about the bishop on h7. Because you might be thinking, wait, can't Keymer go pawn to g6, trapping the bishop? Well, no, because bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen takes. And actually, white has 3 pawns for the bishop, but more than that, the black king has no more defenders. And the pieces are going to swarm up the board. So, we have instead knight to e5, which prepares pawn g6. If white plays something like h4, for example, then pawn g6. And now if takes, then f takes, the queen can't take because the knight defends. And the knight is also under attack. So instead we have bishop back to e4, getting the bishop out of there. Bishop g4, just simply forking the knight and the rook. So the knight retreats, sacrificing the exchange. It still looks like a very scary attack. I mean, Keymer could be in a lot of trouble if queen h5, queen h7 lands. He goes g6, stopping any infiltration. Pawn to h4, preparing pawn h5. We have pawn f5. Keymer starts pushing pawns in front of his own king. It's not the best move. b4 is better. But Keymer throws the pawn to f5. Manvel throws his pawn to h5, sacrificing the bishop because hg6 check would lead to a devastating position after the king moves. There's something like rook h7, king g8, and queen to h5, and literally every single white piece is around the black king. So we have pawn g5, throwing another pawn in front of his own king. I mean, 2 white pieces are under attack, though, so the only move is knight g6. It's the only move. Offering up the knight, which can't be taken, because after takes and takes, king g7, rook h7, if king takes g6, there is simply checkmate after here, and bishop g5. There are ways to avoid the checkmate, but it's still bad. So we have king g8 only move, bishop f5 only move for white, queen f6 still not taking the knight because he doesn't want to open up the h-file, so queen f6 counterattacking. b4 is ready to be played at any point, by the way. Knight e5, rook e5. And remember, Keymer is still up an exchange, but he is down 2 pawns. We have bishop back to c2. Engine prefers g4, locking the bishop in place. But we have bishop back to c2, rook back to e7, pawn to h6, bishop f4, best move, trying to get rid of this dark squared bishop, probably to stop it from coming to d4, I would assume. Pawn h7 check, king h8, king b1, takes, and takes. And Keymer gets to position a little bit safer, although this pawn on h7 could be a big problem for the black king in the future, because it means that the back rank for Keymer is always a problem, but he is up an exchange and only down 1 pawn now. So we have rook f1, queen e5, offering up the f7 pawn, which can't be taken because of rook e1 pinning the queen to the king. In this position, there is actually a winning move for white, rook to f5, because if rook e1, then rook e5, rook e1, and rook d1 and bishop d1, and white is up a piece. So if rook to f5 would be played, then black would have to go queen e7, keeping an eye on the pawns, which would allow queen to d6, which is not good. His opponent doesn't find it, though. He goes pawn a3, giving the king a way out, which looks natural, also stopping b4. We have rook d8, attacking the d-pawn. Again, rook f5 is possible for the exact same reasons, winning control of the d4 square for the white queen. We have queen h5, though. Rook e1 check, forcing a rook trade, king to a2. If the queens come off the board, Keymer should be winning because of the rook versus bishop. Even then, it's not 100% clear because these pawns are both quite strong. But we have queen back to e7, queen to f3, king to g7, marching the king up the board, pawn g4, queen e5, trying to keep everything under control, bishop e4. The bishop is a great piece defending the white pawns, but this is actually a mistake because of queen to f4, trying to force a queen trade. As I said, a queen trade is winning for black because this rook keeps an eye on the d-pawn and the h-pawn, and the king can just march up the board. So let's say something like king b1. I mean, pawn f5 is apparently the best move, but let's say something like king to f6, king c2, king e5, forcing the bishop to move, king d5, And now the h-pawn is taken care of, the d-pawn is gone, and being up the exchange will be winning for black because there's so many pawns left on the board, not to mention these pawns stuck on dark squares, which will be easy targets. So you have queen e2, rook e8 pinning the bishop to the queen. And so his opponent has to try something. He tries to promote to try and attract the rook away from the e-file so that he can play something like bishop to f5. But Keymer simply takes with the king. The queen can't give a check because the queen covers h2. And the bishop is going to be lost. So Manvel resigns the game. Absolutely crazy game, this one. I mean, this was my favorite, which is why I've included it at the end for all of you who stuck around. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to see more videos like this, please let me know. And if you haven't seen the previous video of other games by Vincent Keymer, check out the video up here because you're going to really enjoy it if you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.